Welcome to our part two of our six-part series on James Madison, our fourth president. And we are happy to be able to present this through our cooperation between the Ramsey County Libraries and OLLI at the Osher Lifelong Learning. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to JB Andersen.
Okay. Today we're going to begin by talking about a whole series of conferences that led up to the writing of the United States Constitution. First thing we're going to talk about is a 1785 conference known as the Mount Vernon Conference that was held at George Washington's mansion. The fighting in the Revolutionary War ended in 1781. Treaty was signed in 1783. So here we are a couple of years later now, and people are wondering what to do next concerning the United States government. This is Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. This is where this first conference, known as the Mount Vernon Conference, occurred. There were representatives from just two states that were invited, Virginia and Maryland. And that's because this conference was about territory that was within those states. Madison helped set up this conference to deal with how to handle river traffic and so forth. The Virginia delegates, however, were never notified, so they didn't know about this conference. Topics to be discussed were going to be the number one here, the Potomac River. Here you can see the Potomac River. Here's Washington, D.C., not yet in existence, and it wouldn't be for many years yet. But here's the Potomac River. Number two is the Pocomoke River, and you can see that runs here. Along here, and the Chesapeake Bay is this large inlet for the ocean. So you got a couple of freshwater rivers emptying into Chesapeake Bay, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean flow there. Here is the state of Maryland. Virginia is over in this area up in here. Here's a kind of a close-up of these three areas: the Potomac River on the left, Chesapeake Bay in the center, and the Pocomoke River on your right. However, the conference ended up not dealing with the Chesapeake or Pocomoke River area, dealt only with the Potomac River, which was the gigantic waterway into the state of Virginia. Mount Vernon Conference, what sorts of decisions did they make at this conference? There was a company was created at the conference called the Potomac Company, and its assigned jobs were to keep the river clear of hazards. Rivers were frequently used just to float logs, often for firewood, for building, things like that. Pieces of wood would get away from the large group of wood that would be sailing downriver for building or fire warming purposes. So major item here is keep the river navigable. You don't want boats running into huge logs. Sometimes they were much larger than this appears. You know, they'd be 12 or 20 feet long and could do a lot of damage to a boat. Second, Potomac River's to be controlled by the state of Maryland. Now, it was agreed that Maryland would take care of the Potomac River, but the state of Virginia could also navigate on the Potomac River. So this is basically an agreement between Virginia and Maryland about navigation rights on the Potomac River. Notice here, this is a panhandle state. You know, people think of Oklahoma and Texas, those are panhandle states. We're going to take a little side trip here, but look, here's Maryland. Look at this panhandle that you've got here for the state of Maryland. So this side note, each of these states in red has a panhandle. There's Idaho, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, Florida. West Virginia we'll take a closer look at. Alaska, Connecticut, Florida, Idaho, Maryland, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, and West Virginia. These are the 9 panhandle states in the US. So nearly 20% of all United States states have a panhandle. And look at West Virginia. It actually has 2. Whoop. There's one in red here, and then very obviously this northern panhandle. Here's this map of the US again, showing the 9 states that have panhandles. Third item of major decision at this Mount Vernon conference held at George Washington's mansion was Virginia had to share in the costs. Even though Maryland was going to be doing all the work of keeping the river clear, Virginia could navigate it, but they also needed to pay Maryland for certain items. So there would be navigation aids, you know, the river would be kept clear. The river would have to be defended against people and groups, foreign countries in particular, who would come in without permission, and the banning of piracy. So you needed military that would patrol the Potomac River, and they would look for pirates who were going to try to steal from the ships that were coming in from the ocean up the Potomac River to deliver goods to major cities along the Potomac. Fourth item, a commission was created, and it would deal with future problems, future unforeseen problems that might come up. So you've got the Potomac River Commission, and that's going to be in existence in case there's some surprises. Pennsylvania and Delaware were offered to join this coalition between Virginia and Maryland that was managing the Potomac River. Here, there's 2 large red dots. There's Pennsylvania and Delaware down here. And you can see coming up into this area, Delaware could use the access of the Potomac River and then road surfaces to get goods into the state. Same with Pennsylvania, directly north of the Potomac River. So they were offered join the coalition, but they didn't take part. Most important aspect of this conference was this was a conference between a couple of states, and it ended up establishing how the states could get together and speak with each other and come to agreements with each other. So a model was created for meetings between the states. Because remember, we're under the Articles of Confederation, and there's a weak federal government. So the states need to be talking, speaking to each other. Next conference that we're going to talk about is a year later after the Potomac Conference, Mount Vernon Conference, as it was called, that dealt with the Potomac River. And that's the Annapolis Conference, 1786. Take a look. We're going to take a look at the introduction. Meeting names today are pretty short. You know, it's just called Annapolis Conference. That's what we call it today. But in the 1700s, the names for meetings were much longer. The Annapolis Conference of today in the 1700s was called a meeting of commissioners to remedy defects of the federal government. So you can see that's quite a statement about where a lot of these people are coming from, defects of the federal government. At any rate, it's the Annapolis Conference today, named for the city of Annapolis. This is George Mann's Tavern, and it's where the Annapolis Conference was held, commonly known as the Brick House, but it was a place to go and have some food and drink. It is still in existence. Here's a marker for it. George Mann Troy Tavern Restaurant. And it was chosen for the site of the Annapolis Conference because you could get beer there, so they could have a drink. Water was often considered kind of dangerous, whereas beer had been brewed and fermented and was seen as a far safer drink. 5 of the 13 states were now the United States. This is after the end of the Revolutionary War, and the 13 colonies have become, for some time, the 13 states. So 5 of the 13 states sent delegates to the Annapolis Conference. Those 5 states were New Jersey, located here, New York, here in yellow, Pennsylvania, Delaware, down here, this little tiny orange state, and Virginia in white right there. Those were the 5 states that sent delegates. But there were 4 more of the 13 states that appointed delegates, but none of them ever attended. And those states were Connecticut, located here in blue, Maryland, here in green, South Carolina, pink, and Georgia in gray. So delegates got appointed in 9 states. 5 states showed up, 4 didn't. Total of 12 people attended. Ouch, almost no one. And here are 12 individuals. And there is the symbol here for the Annapolis Conference. Let's talk about the meeting next. We've looked at the area, see who was invited. What were the achievements now of this meeting, the Annapolis Conference? And we're going to talk about 2 of them. Trade considerations were talked about. We're going to trade between the states. What sorts of regulations will there be when trading between the states? And they weren't sure exactly what to do. There weren't enough states there, according to many. They said, we'll leave this open. We'll try to have some other conference later on, and we'll consider this issue of how do the states deal with each other in terms of doing trade. Second item, a constitutional convention is needed. We're under the Articles of Confederation. It is a document with a very weak federal government, and lots of delegates to the Annapolis Conference are saying we need a constitutional convention. And the meeting date that got suggested was May of 1787, and they would meet in Philadelphia, which was, along with New York City, Philadelphia, they were the two big cities in the 13 states. And Philadelphia's where George Washington spent his presidency. Washington, D.C. had not yet been built. Let's take a look at the analysis of this Annapolis conference. Low attendance, gave little weight to the outcome of this conference. Hardly anybody showed up. So what does it really mean? And why do we need to pay any attention to it, etc.? Shays' Rebellion was occurring at the time. Amazingly, this was a real revolution. This is what should be called the American Revolution. What we call the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, many historians, and I believe they're correct, stated that this really was a fight between the upper classes of the 13 colonies and the upper class of England over who would control trade. So what's a revolution? A revolution is people rising up against their leadership. That's not what the American Revolution was about. It should really be called, a class warfare between the two leading classes in the colonies and in England. So Shays' Rebellion was people rising up over and protesting taxation and other items that were of concern to the lower classes. So suddenly a constitutional convention is needed. Future uprisings, strong federal government, these were concerns. What are we going to do about people becoming angry now that the revolution is over and a real revolution is about to begin? Okay, Constitutional Convention. It takes place in 1787. It's an attempt to write a United States Constitution with a stronger federal government than was allowed in the Articles of Confederation. First thing we're going to talk about is introductory material, opposition to the Constitutional Convention. There were people that didn't want this to happen. And then supporters of this Constitutional Convention, the people who did want it to come up with some new ideas about governing. It met in Philadelphia. Many were opposed to this meeting, and it included individuals as well as states. So some states sent no one. Some individuals refused to attend. Keep the Articles of Confederation. We're doing fine with that. We don't need a new document. The most famous opponents to the Constitutional Convention were Thomas Jefferson pictured on the left, and Patrick Henry pictured on the right. They were both from slave states. They were concerned about a strong federal government, what it might do to slavery. Patrick Henry stated, I smell a rat in Philadelphia tending toward monarchy. So his concern was a strong federal government that would reintroduce nobility, which he felt the American Revolution got rid of. So the reality of this Constitutional Convention was there were people who resisted a constitution, the writing of a constitution. Their major concern was you write up a constitution and it's going to give a power to a stronger federal government, and that may mean slavery will be abolished or slavery will be limited horribly. So concern among slave owners and the southern states was a strong federal government run by the North, where the largest amount of population was located, might end up abolishing slavery. Supporters of the those are the people that objected: Jefferson, Patrick Henry, slave owners. Here are supporters. At the top, James Madison wanted a constitution, wanted a stronger federal government. So did George Washington. You know, we frequently say, oh, Washington was non-political. No, he wasn't. He was a Federalist. He believed in a strong federal government. And at the bottom of these three pictures is Robert Morris, a gentleman generally not heard of, and played a very important role at the Constitutional Convention. Who is this guy? He was from Virginia. It's a large state. I mean, it's the big state in the 13 states. And they gave a tremendous amount of money and soldiers in the financing of the American Revolution. Robert Morris's main concern was that this new constitution that was being considered should have a Bill of Rights in it. It should protect people's rights. And as a result, Robert Morris, who fought for a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, is known historically as the father of the Bill of Rights. He is a founding father. Early in the session, lots of delegates didn't show up. They couldn't get a quorum. That's a majority. Let's say, just for easy math, you got 100 people that are invited to this conference. Before you can have a meeting, you need 51 to show up. That's a quorum. You got to have a majority there, or you can't have the meeting. So people are sitting around waiting. There's 40 people who've shown up. They can't start having meetings. The people who have arrived, the 40 who are concerned, well, they may start talking about going home. That would definitely then cancel the Constitutional Convention. But it did not happen. People were willing to sit around and wait. One of the reasons was long travel times. Well, more people are going to show up. It's just taken them a while to get here. They live further away than I did, etc. And then there also was the concerns about slavery. A lot of people aren't showing up because they're worried slavery might be abolished. They may be changing their minds. They may come to this Constitutional Convention, and they may be strong voices for the protection of slavery. So finally, at any rate, enough delegates arrive. A quorum is established. Here's a painting of delegates at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, all white males. This wait time was good for Madison. The fact that people weren't showing up and that they had to hang around and just talk with each other. It allowed Madison to form coalitions among those who had already showed up. So he could have a band of brothers, so to speak, who would be very supportive of a stronger federal government. Madison got Edmund Randolph, pictured here in the upper image. He was the governor of Virginia. And George Mason, remember, father of the Bill of Rights, George Mason was a delegate from Virginia. And he got these two gentlemen, Madison did, to write a civil rights proposal. What sorts of rights do we want people to have in this new Constitution? So they wrote up proposals. They were both from a slave state, Virginia. This helped calm Southerners down. All of a sudden, you got a couple guys from a slave state, and they're going to be the major writers, especially of a Bill of Rights. So looks like they may not be giving rights to slaves, for instance. The proposal that Randolph and Mason wrote up came to be called the Virginia Plan. Let's take a look at the Virginia Plan's 6 major provisions. First thing that we're going to talk about is the formation of a new government, something different from the Articles of Confederation. And the first proposal was there's going to be 3 branches of government, and they'll balance each other out. This will give more power to the president, consequently more power to the federal government than was had in the Articles of Confederation. So more power to the federal government than under the Articles of Confederation. 3 branches of government. And those branches included 2 houses of Congress. There'd be a House of Representatives and a Senate. The House of Representatives would be based on population. Now, if you only had one house and it was based on population, places like Virginia and New York would have a tremendous amount of power because they'd have more delegates because they had the greater population. So there was a concern about large states ending up being in control of this new federal government. So the compromise that got reached was the creation of a Senate that was not based on population. Rather, it was based on statehood. Each state gets 2. So Virginia's got 5 times as many people as Alabama, but they both have 2 senators. So you get in, slavery is an issue here also. If you've got 13 states, say 6 of them are opposed to slavery, that's 12 senators. 7 favor slavery, that's 14 senators. The slave states are in control. They have 2 more votes. Also, just maintaining a balance became very important throughout American history. Got to a point where you had an even number of states, like you'd have 15 states each. Well, if all the slave states voted together, then anti-slavery legislation could not get passed because it would not gain a majority. 15 states each. You got 30 votes and 30 votes. Nobody gets a majority. So the Senate provides equal representation for all states. And of course, the South, this is what they wanted, kept slavery working. The Council of Revision was created as part of the Constitutional Convention. And this Council of Revision, the legislature could pass laws. Now, what if they weren't liked? Well, let's have a council that says, that's no good, you can't do it. We have the power to veto any legislation. So these legislative laws that get passed by Congress end up really simply being proposals that then go through the Council of Revision. And that's where it's decided if they can become a law or not. The United States Senate, another proposal, can veto any state laws. That is indeed the case. Any federal law that's passed takes precedence over state laws that may be in conflict with it. The Articles of Confederation are to be abolished. This is number 5 of the 6 major provisions at the Constitutional Convention. So we get rid of the Articles of Confederation. We have a whole new document now establishing a stronger federal government. Articles of Confederation are abolished. And the new Constitution has to be ratified by the states. So the state legislatures will vote on whether to accept this new Constitution or not. And it did indeed get accepted. This Virginia plan, let's take a look at the debate. Debate was heavy about these items. Madison wanted a single executive called a president, be one at a time. Here's a picture of 5 living ex-presidents. At any rate, Madison wanted in the executive branch a single president. Well, how could you have more than one? Well, some places do. Some nations have a president who's in charge of domestic affairs, what goes on within this nation, what legislation is going to be passed here by this domestic affairs body. Then you have a foreign affairs body. That's within a nation state, and they deal with other nation states. Third item is you have a ceremonial head. And this is somebody that, a foreign dignitary shows up, and this is like the King of England. Okay, come to dinner. So the political people do not meet at dinner, as happens today in the United States. Instead, in England, you meet with ceremonial leaders for dinners. In this case, the king. Here's King Charles. So England has a prime minister, and it also has a royalty. And the royalty performs this ceremonial function. So domestic affairs, you got a president, or some similar term that's used. Foreign affairs, you got a president. Ceremonial affairs, you got a nobility of some sort. This has been proposed for the United States. President's way too busy, and then he has to do all this ceremonial stuff also. Get rid of the ceremonial aspects of the presidency. Have somebody who you elect for 10 years who's going to be in charge of entertainment. Hopes and concerns for this Virginia plan, this new constitution that's being written up. Number one, prevent factions from forming. Faction is what in the late 1700s political parties were called. And there were people that were starting to line up based on political parties, such as Madison and Washington as Federalists. They wanted a strong federal government. You had Monroe and Jefferson wanted a weak federal government. They formed the Democratic Party. These were not called political parties. They were called factions at the time. The concern was factions would deny rights to people, and we just can't have this kind of infighting. We've got to stop the formation of these political parties. Some of the issues that they would take up that would be very divisive would be slavery, especially favoring slavery, anti-feminism. These new constitutional rights do not apply to women. They're anti-sexual preference. They apply only to heterosexuals, or they're anti-abortion groups. Might be any number of possible political issues that come about, and certain political parties get identified with them. So we do indeed see anti-abortion being a primary issue for a single political party in the modern world, that is the Republican Party. Same with sexual preference items, and there are people within parties who support sexual preference decisions. There are people within the same political party who do not support it. Second item, economics is a problem. It can be a big problem almost anywhere, anytime, and creates a class system also. You get a lot of people who are able to bundle together a pretty reasonable chunk of money. This separates groups of people. It creates classes of people. Karl Marx wrote about this, and Karl Marx's concern was we need to be rid of the class system. We can't be having people who are extremely wealthy because that wealth will mean they'll be running the show. This is Marx created a way of interpreting history. So you get people who write about economic history and whether or not there should be classes of people or get rid of the class system, which was Marx's notion. So Western Europe has succeeded reasonably well at controlling these economic issues and controlling the tremendous expansion of wealth among individuals. They do it by controlling economies. As a result, they have very little inflation. Now compare that to the United States. Lots of inflation, lots of economic difficulties often. Certainly class system where you've got some people making a minimum wage of about $10 an hour, and other people who have a tremendous amount of wealth that goes into and well over $100 billion. What about small states and large states? This was an issue with the Constitutional Convention. These large states, they're going to end up having a big voice over the smaller states. So where's the fairness in that? We need political concerns here that will balance power, not establish power based on population. And again, the creation of the United States Senate is what got rid of the power of large states based on population. This 2 senators from each state means that the heavy population in some states that's represented in the House of Representatives can be struck down when that bill goes to the Senate and needs to be passed there, where it's not based on population. So again, slavery becomes an issue here. People are concerned about slavery being abolished. The largest state here was the state of Virginia at the time. Now, West Virginia had not been created as a state yet. Virginia today has lost all of this area up in here. And the reason for that is this portion of Virginia was anti-slavery and very low population. And in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, the United States recognized the western portion of Virginia as a free state. So the state of West Virginia got created. And today, Virginia just looks, the line is cut off across here. The executive branch getting too strong, lots of people, again, slavery's an issue. What if the executive branch passes legislation? In England, their parliament passes legislation. End of story. It's the law. In the United States, the Congress passes legislation. Then it goes to the presidential branch, and the president can veto it. Then it can go back to the congressional branch, and with a much larger majority vote, the veto by the president can be overrun. It takes a 2/3 majority. So you need 67 votes, and you in United States Senate, and whatever 2/3 of 435 is, you get that kind of a vote in the House and Senate, and you can override a presidential veto. One of the major concerns over the last 70 years has been the development of a very strong presidency, and it has come to be called the imperial presidency. I have a concern here too that we simply don't hear about, and that's the Supreme Court. They can say something and bingo, that's it. There's nothing can be done about it. You have to pass a whole new set of laws. So there's a special power to the Supreme Court also, not just to the presidency over the last 70 years, having become far more powerful. This is Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a professor at Harvard, wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency, started this whole argument about how the presidency is getting much stronger. He was an advisor to John F. Kennedy during the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s. And he wrote about the executive branch of government, the presidency, getting too strong. This book came out in 1973, and it was revised again in 2004. It's still in print. Talks about the difficulties, the escalation of power within the presidential branch of government. Are we getting out of balance? We have these three branches of government in order to maintain a balance. Are we getting out of balance? Okay, let's take a look at delegates who object to this Virginia plan. Federal government should be a fundraiser, not the states. So states raising money, well, larger states are going to have a lot more people. If they issue a tax within their state, they're going to collect a lot more money. The federal government collecting overall from among all the states doesn't give a state power over other states. Rather, the money is collective, and it's determined by the federal government how it will be spent. Now, one way of gaining money is tariffs. England comes to your port city on the Atlantic Ocean, and and the city and the state can collect a tariff. They get some money. This again gives more power to states, to cities. What about states that don't have ports? They're landlocked, or they do have access to the ocean, but they don't have goods. So the whole system becomes pretty unfair of tariffs being collected at the state level or at the city level. It should be a function of the federal government. So federal government can also offer a greater protection for people who own property. The big issue at this time in the late 1700s is the United States taking over Native American lands. Well, now who owns it? The British are involved in this also. Do the British own this land? Do the Native Americans own it? Does the state own it? Does the United States own it? What's going to happen to this property that's being taken over? And as the United States moves westward, Britain has forts all around the Great Lakes. We claim we own that territory. How do we get Britain out of there? What about the Native American tribal groups and the land that they occupy, etc.? So, Constitutional Convention, who owns the property is an issue that gets discussed. Madison, who we're talking about here, James Madison, is the president. His whole argument is the federal government doesn't have enough power. We need a single entity. We need to stop infighting, etc. The Federalist Papers we're going to talk about next. The Federalist Papers were a group of writings done by three individuals that were supportive of the United States Constitution. So they were put out before votes were being taken in the states for approval of the Constitution. And there was lots of opposition to this new Constitution and this much stronger federal government. The opposition came from a group called the Anti-Federalists. So if you're opposed to the Constitution, you're an anti-federalist. If you support the Constitution, you are a Federalist. It's been lots of books about anti-federalism. Here's one, Patrick Henry, Robert Yates, Samuel Bryan, Founding Fathers. They were opposed to a strong federal government. And here's another one. This is a book. It's available on Amazon, and it's a history of the anti-federalist movement by a historian, Ralph Ketchum. Well, these Federalist papers were written and published in newspapers across the country in response or in attempts to answer questions and concerns that these anti-federalists have. And they were written anonymously. The three men who wrote the Federalist Papers didn't want their names being used, and they were John Jay here, a founding father, and first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, James Madison in the middle, and Alexander Hamilton. And together, they wrote the Federalist Papers supporting the new United States, the proposed United States Constitution. The name that they placed on the papers was Publius. Makes it sound Roman, adds weight to their arguments, like, hey, this is a really big deal. Look at the Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years, and so which was common at this time. Many people would publish works using Latin names. And here is the Federalist Papers in a book, not as an article appearing in newspapers over the course of several months. This is when they were all brought together and published in book form, and they have been published continuously since 1787. Here's another example of the book. There's been several versions of these Federalist Papers published. Here's kind of a cartoon of these three guys that wrote the Federalist Papers. Jay has his eyes closed. Madison has got his eyes wide open, and Hamilton looks very surprised and suspicious. Okay, let's take a look at who wrote what. There's 34, there's 85 Federalist Papers. John Jay wrote 5 of them. James Madison wrote 29 of them. And Alexander Hamilton wrote 51 of them. John Jay wrote 5.9% of the Federalist Papers. Madison, 35.1%. And Hamilton wrote 60% of the Federalist Papers, supporting the passage of the United States Constitution. The two most famous items, each of these essays has a number, so you go 1 through 85. The big ones that political scientists and historians consider to be of greatest significance are number 10 and number 51. Number 10 says you got to have a representative democracy. In other words, people get to vote based on population. They have someone they can write to or talk to about their concerns. And avoid political parties is a major element of item number 10. Do not allow factions to gain hold. Well, that didn't happen, of course, We do indeed have political parties. We've had several of them. Number 51 talks about the separation of powers. You got to have three branches of government: a legal, an executive, and a legislative. Congress, a president, a Supreme Court. And each one has power over the others. Here's Patrick Henry. He supported the revolution. He famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," but he was opposed to the Constitution. And it's because he was constipated. Sounds like Constitution. Anyway, he did not like the idea of a strong federal government. State of New York, pictured here in red, that was the state most opposed to the U.S. Constitution. And it's not a slave state, interestingly enough. The reason they were opposed was there was no list of rights in the Constitution. What sorts of rights do the people have? So a promise gets made by the other colonies, and they're telling New York, no, you should vote for this. What we'll do is we'll add amendments to the Constitution that will deal with individual rights, with civil liberties. So that's the promise we're going to make to you. And the state of New York's going, no, they need to be in the body of the Constitution. It's much more difficult to change them then than if they're an amendment to the Constitution. National Congress. Madison wins a seat. Madison wanted to be a senator from Virginia, but his support for a strong federal government in a state that was concerned about a strong federal government being opposed to slavery became very difficult for him, almost impossible to become a senator because senators were not elected. They were not elected by the people until 1914. Is when it started. The senators were appointed by state legislatures. So you'd get people who wanted to be senators, they would go to the state legislature and they would say, hey, vote for me, you guys. They didn't have to go to the public. Now, what happens is, here's $5, a lot of money in the late 1700s, please vote for me. The Senate ended up becoming called the Millionaires Club until the early 1900s, when we began direct election by the people of U.S. senators. Now, Madison wanted the job as senator from Virginia. However, it was an anti-federalist state, and Madison was a federalist. Patrick Henry, who wanted a weak federal government, ended up really controlling the Virginia state legislature, and he was able to get anti-federalist candidates appointed to the U.S. Senate from the state of Virginia. So Madison had no power there. Madison decides he's going to run for the House of Representatives. Here's where the people vote. So we'll see what happens. He feels that he can get elected by the people. Now, Patrick Henry had all these congressional districts within the state of Virginia. Basically, they were gerrymandered, although that term didn't exist yet. He got them laid out, so they favored the anti-federalist movement. And hopefully then because of the way that these congressional districts were laid out, the only people that could be elected from the state of Virginia to the House of Representatives were anti-federalists. James Monroe, who was conservative, Patrick Henry got Monroe from the state of Virginia to run against James Madison in the House district that Madison was hoping to win. So they ran against each other. And the issue in the election became a Bill of Rights, with Madison supporting a Bill of Rights. We will add these amendments that give civil rights to individuals. Well, Monroe lost. Patrick Henry's chosen candidate of the Anti-Federalist, and Madison, the pro-strong federal government fellow, wins. He got 57% of the vote. That's a big win. James Madison and George Washington in the National Congress. Madison's now in the House of Representatives, and as a result, he has lots of contact with George Washington, who's president of the United States, actually becomes an advisor from within the House to President Washington. There's a book that was written about this relationship between Washington and Madison by Stuart Liebigger, called Founding Friendship and the Creation of the American Republic. Again, book that you can buy. You'd get it quickest through Amazon. If you want to wait 2 or 3 weeks, you can order it through a bookstore. Madison helped write the first inaugural address that was delivered by George Washington. So this was very close advisor. He's not only advising Washington, he's writing speeches for him, including an inaugural address. He added the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. It was part of what Washington and Madison wanted. They got along very well with each other, behaved very well with each other. They had common ideas, so they made quite the team. Also, interestingly enough, Madison prepared a congressional response to the first inaugural address. He had helped Washington write it. Now he's preparing a congressional response to it. So today, those responses are written by your political opposites. You know, we listen to a State of the Union address, and it's immediately followed by a member of the opposition party to the president, and they're making comments about what the president discussed. This occurs with inaugural addresses also. Here is the swearing in of George Washington. Here he is putting his hand on the Bible, and he's on a balcony in New York City. And this gate that you see here, that gate has been preserved, and it's in the New York City Museum. I've gone there and stood in front of that gate. So this is the scene and the place where Washington took the oath of office and delivered the first inaugural address in New York City. The building is now long gone, but that gate has been preserved. Madison aided George Washington in the selection of cabinet members. They were concerned about the anti-federalists. Consequently, they appointed anti-federalists, hoping that that would satisfy the whole anti-federalist movement. It was an attempt at reconciliation and compromise between the Federalists, Madison and Washington, and the anti-federalists. At the time, there were 4 cabinet members. Today, there's 25. There's actually 16 cabinet members, but there's 9 other individuals with the title of director and administrator who sit in on cabinet meetings. So cabinet meetings have grown tremendously from 4 to 25 individuals. National Congress, Madison, legislation, Bill of Rights. The tariff of 1789, tariff is a tax on goods imported into a country from another country. This was the first act passed by the new United States Congress. And it protected U.S. industries. England could make goods very inexpensively, far less expensive than it costs to make them within the colonies. So this first legislation that got passed was really the United States government protecting United States industry against lower prices from European powers. So, hey, day one, we're supporting businesses. It also raised money for the government. Today, the amount of money that's given directly to businesses is pretty staggering. The tariff of 1789, it was 50 cents on every ton of goods. That's every 2,000 pounds on anything imported from a foreign country to the United States. If you were a U.S. ship and you'd gone and bought something in a foreign country and now you're bringing it back to the U.S., then there's just 6 cents a ton tax or tariff on those goods because you're an American-owned company. And there are 6 pennies there, although these Lincoln pennies did not exist for decades yet. 50% fee, what was it on? It was on clothing. It was on ships coming in that were foreign, even if they were empty, or a ship built in England coming in and being sold to someone in the United States. There'd be a tariff on that. Tobacco, a tremendous amount of tobacco was grown within the United States. So importing tobacco from other countries was frowned upon. Salt, we can make our own salt. We have ocean water that we can evaporate. We don't need salt that's been made in England, so we tax that. And indigo is a dye, and it's a kind of a bluish or a purple color dye. So you bring in this dye from a foreign country, and that is taxed at the 50% level, or it's actually, I'm sorry, that should be 50 cents. Oops. Yeah, I'll change that. That should be 50-cent fee per ton on those 5 items. Tariff of 1789. Purpose, raise prices on British goods, protect American goods. The British goods were far cheaper than the U.S. goods. This has been called historically a big deal. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not levy such tariffs. So now all of a sudden, the federal government has a way to make some money. The major dispute was between the North and the South. These tariff taxes are basically on industrial goods, manufactured goods. The North is a manufacturing area in the United States. It benefited a great deal from these tariffs. It protected the higher prices the United States had to charge compared to European countries. In the South, very little benefit to the South. They were agricultural. They didn't have stuff coming into their ports. They were selling stuff out, cotton in particular. So little benefit to the South. So here you get that North-South conflict again. Compromise of 1790, federal government should pay off state war debts. These war debts are from the American Revolution. Federal government should pay them off. Jefferson says no. He says that kind of power could end slavery, federal government controlling war debts. Also, Jefferson's major complaint was that Virginia had already paid off almost all of its war debts, so it would not have much of an advantage. Compromise of 1790, this is known as the Madison Compromise. We're going to pay off state debts, and in exchange for allowing us to do that at the federal level, we will build a national capital in the South. So Washington, D.C. is selected as a national capital, and it's a chunk of the state of Virginia, a southern state and a slave state. So the South gets the capital, and in exchange, the federal government will be responsible for war debts. Here's the United States Supreme Court. Here's the Library of Congress. This is the Capitol building. Securities could be sold as a result of this compromise of 1790. So basically what it was wealthy people would buy a security from the federal government, and they'd buy it for $80, and 20 years later it would pay off at $100, or 7 years later. And the federal government then was raising money to pay off those war debts. Here's such a certificate, a bond that people could buy. They were expensive. They were for rich folks. So only the rich could afford these bonds. They became beholden and very supportive of the federal government. But it ended up benefiting the United States very well, because the United States was able to establish a credit rating among European countries. They could say, oh, look at all the money we're sitting on. We got these bonds that we've sold and so on. And they could act as collateral so that the United States could get loans from Europe. It was these loans that made the Louisiana Purchase possible. Now it's interesting. Jefferson didn't want these war debts paid off, but he's willing to use these methods in order to get things working. Residence Act 1790 continues. United States Capitol became possible as a result of this act, promised in the Compromise of 1790. So the Residence Act, okay. U.S. Capitol. Where are we going to put it? Well, it was decided it'd be in Washington, D.C., but that was not one of the cities that was being considered. until the compromise was required. Here are cities that were being considered for the U.S. Capitol: Annapolis, Maryland; Germantown, Pennsylvania; Lancaster, Pennsylvania; New York City; Nottingham, New Jersey; Philadelphia; Princeton, and Princeton, New York; Reading, Pennsylvania; Williamsburg, Virginia; Wilmington, Delaware. Finally, it was decided it would be in the state of Virginia in a new territory called Washington District of Columbia. Columbia meaning Christopher Columbus. So our capital is named for George Washington and Christopher Columbus. So Madison wrote the Bill of Rights. It was 12 amendments to the Constitution. Only 10 were adopted. And I'm ready to quit. What I'd like to do next week when we begin is we'll talk about the Bill of Rights and its addition here to the Constitution. So let me quit this. And okay, let's see. Do we have questions?
We
Not?
do have just a couple, and we're going to go back to the Mount Vernon conference. Somebody was wondering, is like, was Virginia represented in this? And so it's kind of a question of who decided to hold the conference, who was sent then to the conference, and how was representation decided at these conferences back under the Articles of Confederation?
Well, each state would pick a delegation who would then be sent to the city, such as the Annapolis Convention, for instance.
Okay.
And
So,
however,
go ahead.
many people were opposed to attending these conferences. So frequently they didn't attend. It was up to the individual once they got appointed by a state legislature. So that part of it became difficult, and it's what made for difficulty in even starting the meetings because they could not get a forum or a majority of people. Although the meetings ended up taking place. So it basically that's how it was formed. The state would appoint individuals to go to these national conferences, and frequently the state who did the appointing of individuals would tell them not to go. Frequently they would decide individually, I'm not going,
So part of why they wanted a stronger federal government is just there was probably no way to make these people go and represent. Okay. And then this is a question I had also, but somebody asked, what makes a panhandle state a panhandle state? Because if you think about it, Minnesota kind of has something that juts out, but it's not a panhandle state.
That's and that's a mighty small handle. You'd have to have a 3-month-old hand in order to pick up that north west, that little butt out into Canada there.
Right, and we think of it more so as it's super small, so it has to be something that looks like it would be a panhandle on a pan that you could pick up. And unfortunately, Minnesota's.
Although like Idaho, the panhandle is pointing upward. So but if you turn it, you got a big handle there. So there's 9 states that are considered panhandle states. Who decided that they were panhandle states? I don't know, but it has to do with size. And that Minnesota jut out into Canada and at Lake of the Woods is just a tiny little thing.
Okay. Going back to the first conference, we have a couple more questions that came in. It was said regarding the first conference, the Mount Vernon one, that the Virginia delegation had not been invited.
Yeah. It was Virginia and Maryland, and it was
So,
about management of the Potomac River, and nobody ever sent an official, hey, here's a letter, here's where you guys should show up, etc. But they came anyway.
okay, so even though they weren't officially appointed, they still represented Virginia's interests.
Well, yes, and it's why Maryland got the big effort of we're going to be the ones that clean it up, and we're going to be the ones that collect the money, and you're going to have to help pay for it. And the responsibility of maintaining the Potomac River really fell with Maryland as a result.
Okay.
Yeah.
Somebody going back to the Panhandle recommended a really good book called How the States Got Their Shapes. So we can
Oh,
always, if you're interested in that, look it up at the library. Um,
yes, I have a copy of that book also, but yeah, it's how the states got their shape. Yep.
okay, and then I think we have time for one more question or so, unless somebody else comes up. It's what were the two amendments that were not adopted in the Bill of Rights?
Well, I will talk about that next week.
Okay,
There were 12 proposals and 10 were accepted. And the one has never been passed. A
okay,
second one that didn't get passed in the 1700s got passed in the 1980s. And we'll talk about those next week.
next week. Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, then we do have time for more questions if anyone has any. Let's see. Oh, why during this time were there so many leaders from Virginia?
Virginia was the big state, and it had the plantations. It was a slave state. So you had a tremendous amount of slaves who had no power, and you had a tremendous amount of plantation owners who had a great deal of wealth. They owned upwards of like 5,000 acres. Uh, it was a two-class system,
Okay.
basically. I mean, the South was like that up through the end of slavery. It was basically owners at the top and then workers with minimal wages. These were white folks, and then slaves. And uh, and Virginia was just a giant in that two-class system. You know, Monticello's. You could travel Virginia and go to the mansions of these founding fathers, and you could spend all summer, you know, looking at stuff.
Right. Yeah. Well, being wealthy grants you access to a good education. So that does seem to explain that.
Plus,
And
they built universities for themselves. William and Mary was the big university that all the wealthy children would attend at this time. Uh, Madison was an exception to that. He
mhm,
went to school in New Jersey. Talked about that last week.
yeah.
Uh, William and Mary was built around a swamp, and people thought that's what made you sick. And Madison had been sickly through his youth. So he went high up in the mountains where the air was clean in New Jersey instead of going to that acceptable William and Mary for the rich folks.
Okay, wondering if you'll be talking about the influences of Robert Morris and George Mason as well as Madison on the Bill of Rights.
Yes,
Okay, so that'll be next week.
yes, yeah.
So something to look forward to. Um, so I do know that last session is up on the OLLI YouTube website. There will be a link on the library's website. Fortunately, our catalog online is been having issues the last 2 days, so I'm not gonna guarantee that it's gonna be there this week. I'm hoping it'll get posted, but for sure next week it will be posted on our website. But like I said, it is on the OLLI website, the first session. And let's see, trying to
Uh,
take care of any other business. Go ahead.
well, I just would like to say that I put out an announcement, usually on Monday. And for Wednesday, it includes an outline of the lecture material. If you'd like to be on that mailing list, write to me, small case JB at 1717. It's JB 1717 at Comcast.net. So write to me, JB 1717 at the symbol Comcast.net. And you can then receive my weekly reports. And I send them out even when class isn't in session, including all summer. And usually have, oftentimes I'll have a little 2-page reading or something with it. And announce lunch. We have a lunch on Mondays. Used to get about 25 people. Since COVID, we've been getting 8 to 12 people roughly. So if you want some face-to-face contact and conversation, you can also get information about that by being on the mailing list. Good, thank you.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I think we are just inching up to 2 o'clock here. So we will say goodbye for the day. Thank you for everyone for attending and for asking questions. And thank you, JB, for your time and your talents and sharing your information.
Thank you.
Thanks.